We started on time, so I will start to keep on time. It's 101. Welcome, and thank you everyone for joining us at the third webinar of our new GMF webinar series, where every month we will feature thematic presentations focused on the Green Municipal Fund programs. My name is Anne-Charlotte Olivier. I'm a project officer with the Green Municipal Fund's capacity development team. And I'm here with my colleagues Kiana and Anahi, who will make sure the webinar runs smoothly today. And we have more participants joining, that's great. Our third webinar is dedicated to the broad sector of land use. And so a great way to start our discussion today is on behalf of FCM, to acknowledge that I am joining you from lands that have been inhabited by indigenous peoples for thousands of years. We at FCM recognize the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people as the traditional custodians of the land upon which FCM's offices are located. I personally am also currently located in Ottawa. We also recognize the contributions of Métis, Inuit, and all First Nations, both in shaping and strengthening this community and country as a whole. So please, wherever you are, join me in paying our respects to the original stewards of this land and committing ourselves to thoughts and action that will lead to meaningful reconciliation wherever we live now. And if we can go to the next slide, Kiana. Thank you. A few housekeeping items to get through. For technical assistance, please click on the button, raise your hand, which is located at the bottom of your screen, and one of us will help you. There will be time today for questions. So you are welcome to ask any questions in the language of your choice, English or French, through the chat box or through the Q&A box during the presentations. You can find both at the bottom of your screen. And I will keep an eye out for any clarification questions or other key items that we should discuss and address during the session throughout the webinar. I also invite yourself to introduce, I invite you to introduce yourself in the chat box now to say hello. Maybe you could tell us where you're from, where you're joining us from. This way also, you know where the chat box is. And I will speak French now. Si vous souhaitez écouter les présentations en français, veuillez cliquer sur le bouton d'interprétation simultanée qui se trouve en bas de votre écran. Et il faut cliquer sur le canal français. Et n'hésitez pas à poser vos questions en français ou en anglais dans la boîte de discussion ou la boîte de questions et réponses qui se situe également en bas de votre écran. Back to English. And next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, our third webinar is dedicated to the broad sector of land use. I believe that if you're with us today, it's because you'd like to learn more about the implications of land use decisions and development patterns in your community, whether it's a rural, coastal, or urban one. So stick with us for the next 50-ish minutes now, as our speakers will share innovative insights of the benefits of integrated planning for intensifications and the ways in which it fosters complete, compact, and resilient communities. So here's an overview of the agenda, starting by providing a bit of context and definition, followed by a high-level contrast of different growth patterns presented by Jeremy Murphy. Then we will have two representatives from Edmonton detailing their approach to transforming the urban shape of the city by shifting the urban growth pattern and catalyzing redevelopment, including brownfield redevelopment. And I'm sure you'll have some questions, so we'll take some time to address the questions before sharing land use related resources and saying a goodbye for now. Again, questions are welcome in the chat at any time, in English and French, and they will be answered during the Q&A. Note that this session is being recorded and will be accessible on the FCM's website. Next slide, please, Kiana. So what we're hoping this webinar will help you with is what to consider when developing or renewing your community's land use strategy through the review of successful examples of municipalities with integrated land use approaches, how to plan for and manage sustainable growth over time by determining the financial and climate implications of growth patterns, what they are and which may be right for your community. We also hope that if you have one, that will help you understand how your brownfield strategy can fit into your community growth planning exercise, and also helping you gaining access to some related resources and tools. So next slide, please, Kiana. Before we dive in, we have a quick poll because speakers and I would like to get to know our audience today. So I will launch a poll, which is about you and your community. You should see the poll on your screen now. So let us know, what stage is your community at? Are you more at the early stages of planning and you're looking for inspiration? Do you have a vision, but you're still on the design drafting phase? Or are you currently implementing a land use strategy? Or maybe you're not directly involved in your municipal planning, but you are interested in the subject. So this one would be answer D. Okay, I'll give a few more seconds. I have about 60% of you who have answered. Okay, we're going up. 80%. Okay, I'll take it. Let's see. And I'll share the results. So that's good to know that most of you are still at the early stages of planning. So I'm really happy because this webinar hopefully will give you more insights, good insights and good tips. See, some of you are a bit more advanced, which is good too. The Edmonton's case study is for you. And we have a bunch of you who are very interested in the subject. So happy to have you here. Okay, thank you. And let's move on the next slide, Kiana. So we'll start with Jeremy Murphy from SSG, who will provide some general context and a high-level contrast of different growth patterns. Let me first introduce and welcome Jeremy. Next slide, please, Kiana. A climate change planner and SSG principal for 14 years, Jeremy leads teams to help local governments navigate current and expected climate change challenges. A big vision thinker and detailed-oriented analyst, Jeremy is experienced with energy and emission modeling, climate change mitigation and adaptation planning, land use planning, and public engagement. His projects include creating carbon reduction pathways for Vancouver, Banff, Saskatoon, Ottawa, Tacoma, and dozens more. Jeremy is passionate about local climate action, believing in the power of local governments, their partners, and residents to foster decarbonized, healthy, and equitable communities. Jeremy, over to you.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. So I'll share my screen. Get going on this presentation. There we go. All right, so I'm joining you from the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh People's Lands here in Vancouver. So it's morning for me. So just some high-level context and some research that we've been doing at SSG for FCM in the development of a land use planning, costing, and energy and emissions tool. and to set the stage for what Hoeda and Liam are going to talk about next. I think most of us probably know the urban population is growing. The global urban population is 56% of total population currently, expected to grow to almost 70% of total global population in 2050. This is going to put some pressure on our city systems, and it gives us an opportunity to really think about what our smart development decisions should be. Another driver of that is global strife. So we're seeing increased urbanization from global conflicts, most recently in Ukraine, but also in Sudan, Syria, Myanmar, Venezuela, a host of others. And that is also going to be exacerbated by climate change impacts. So we're going to see increasing instances of climate refugees, and many countries are already seeing influxes of climate refugees. Meanwhile, cities account for 70% of global emissions already. So we're going to have these urban stresses, these opportunities as well to kind of make smart development decisions, and ones that also can decrease emissions. And so we have a spectrum of choices when it comes to development, of course, and the typical North American historical development pattern of choice is greenfield development, or urban sprawl, it's often called. And we know that greenfield development is cheap to build. Typically, the developer pays for new infrastructure like sewer, water, sometimes electrical, etc., the roads. But the municipality ends up operating and maintaining that infrastructure, so there's an ongoing cost. And the municipal services have to accommodate a sparse population in these types of developments. So it's kind of tricky where you're situating your fire department, your police departments, your hospitals, your operating your snow removal equipment, etc. It's a costly endeavor. And of course, there are socioeconomic costs, and these aren't necessarily germane to greenfield. Some of these are present in other types of development, but lots of studies show that there's significantly higher costs to physical and mental health. There's high instances of community segregation or feelings of isolation, reduced family time from the time that you spend commuting to work. Although I guess with lockdown, maybe that's the opposite these days, and maybe you've had too much family time in recent years. Increased accidents from increased travel and increased transportation costs for families. Urban infill, on the other hand, we know it's expensive, a little more expensive to build. It's typically more expensive to build up than out. But it's much, much cheaper to connect to the infrastructure that already exists than to build new infrastructure and add the cost of maintaining that infrastructure indefinitely. The municipal services accommodate a dense population, so typically things like community centers, parks, etc., have very high usage from the dense population. And then similarly, socioeconomic costs, they're maybe slightly different, but they still exist in cities, of course. Mental health concerns due to crowding and noise issues, especially. Air pollution effects on public health, and housing costs, which typically are a little more expensive than in suburban or exurban locales. So that's a quick comparison between kind of the two extremes of the development spectrum. And now we have a few examples here of different cities who have run these scenarios, these development scenarios, to kind of help them decide what investments they want to make, and especially what the ongoing costs of those developments will be over 10, 20, 30 or more years. And so Calgary, Alberta, which I think it's fair to say is well known for expansion, annexing land from the county and expanding outwards in its developments, ran scenarios several years ago for how it would accommodate population by 2050. And the modeling in that case determined that infill development saved 33% on new infrastructure, 36% on street life cycles, so the building and the repair and maintenance of roads, 55% on water and wastewater infrastructure, 14% on road, water, wastewater, fire and park services, etc. And for the same cost to provide transit in infill developments versus greenfield developments, the service could be doubled. So Calgary determined that infill was much cheaper for the municipality to implement and operate. That hasn't necessarily meant that there has been no sprawling developments in Calgary since this study was done, but some of the decisions in Calgary are made based on this information now. Prince George, BC, a much smaller community with about 75,000 people in northern BC, whereas Calgary is about 1.2 or 1.3 million people right now. They also explored greenfield versus infill scenarios, several different scenarios for the future of their community. And they found that the infrastructure cost savings on infill development were phenomenal, 95% infrastructure costs, mostly because new developments for infill were simply connecting to existing infrastructure, and there was a small connection investment for that compared to greenfield development. Interestingly, they did a study on household operating costs. And so the household operating costs for a home in infill development versus greenfield saved 14%. There's 21% savings on infrastructure replacement costs versus the greenfield scenario, and 18% savings on external costs like vehicles, energy costs, pollution and climate impacts. However, they did have 12% lower tax revenues in the infill scenario, and that's based on the taxation structure that the city has. So there's two examples for you. Oh, I should mention Prince George. It was part of the study was part of several case studies that the BC government did using the Community Lifecycle Infrastructure Costing tool. CLIC for short, and you can check that out. And there's a few other examples. So just very quickly, there were those kind of quantitative studies that were done. Of course, there's lots of qualitative indicators that are different between greenfield and infill development strategies. This is going to be contextual, of course. This is a high-level overview, and it will vary from between any development situation. But physical health and well-being, walkability, societal inclusion, these are all typically a little higher indicators in infill development scenarios. Safety is highly dependent on the circumstance. It can be very similar between greenfield and infill developments. Similarly with access to nature, it really depends on where you are. But typically greenfield has a bit higher access to nature. Indoor comfort, typically a bit higher in greenfield. Affordable housing really depends on the circumstance. Greenfield typically cheaper to buy and rent though, but infill typically higher mix of housing and more choice of housing. And then social mobility in terms of kind of the equity that you would build up or the opportunity that you have for buying or renting homes, a big part of that indicator, typically a little higher in infill urban developments. So lastly, there were a couple of projects that SSG did over the past year or two where we were asked to model different land use developments proposals to determine the emissions in each of them, in each of the scenarios. So this is one we did for Halton region in Ontario. Halton region is about 700,000 people outside of Toronto. And it's a very agricultural region, has several small to medium municipalities within it. And there's a lot of pressure on the agricultural lands there for development. So we had three main scenarios that we investigated. The base case scenario one would develop 3,300 hectares of agricultural land to accommodate new homes. The second scenario was 2,150 hectares. And then the third was all infill development and required no new agricultural development. And so we calculated the emissions in each of the scenarios from the energy that homes use, the energy that all the other building stock uses, industrial, commercial, and institutional. We calculated the emissions from transportation and wastewater, et cetera. And so we found that cumulatively, scenario two saved 3,300 kilotons of emissions between now and 2051. Scenario three saved 5,700 kilotons of emissions between now and 2051. And to give you kind of an idea of what that translates to, it's about 772,000 or 1.3 million homes worth of annual emissions. So it's substantial over time. And so this is a type of exercise, this is a type of indicator that you can use to help make development decisions in the face of the climate crisis. Similarly, with North Cowichan, BC, North Cowichan's about 35,000 people on Vancouver Island, and they're planning for about another 10,000 homes by 2050. We had three different scenarios that we investigated for that community. And similarly, the cumulative savings, the more the development was focused on infill, the more emissions were saved. So 7,200 tons, in this case, not kilotons, 7,200 tons of emissions cumulatively for a more dense scenario versus a sprawling scenario. And in scenario three, 19,000 tons cumulatively. So about 2,100 and 6,000, in this case, vehicles annual emissions. The difference between Halton region and North Cowichan, a big difference is the emissions factor of their electricity supply. So there you have it in vehicle annual emissions equivalents. So not nothing, and a good indicator by which to help you make development decisions. And of course, everything that I presented right now seems to point to infill or bust. But I think that there are also some very understandable fears of infill development. And we all have buildings that we hate in cities. We all have neighborhoods or blocks that we find oppressive or noisy. And these are all developments that we've done in the past that haven't necessarily made all the considerations necessary to make a very inviting, human scale, comfortable, high quality sense of place for us. And so these are all things to consider with the urbanization of the global population, with climate change effects coming to us. Cities can address these fears by some of these considerations, like mandating holistic development approaches, higher consideration for aesthetics and usability. For example, in high density infill developments, making more availability of 3-bedroom and 4-bedroom apartments and homes is very important, and we don't see a lot of that in most developments. Just to provide options and choice for everybody. The compact, complete communities that Anne Charlotte was mentioning, and to define neighborhoods to make people feel at home. So there's lots of different things that we can do. I think cities have to be vigilant about it to make the correct decisions going forward. So that's a high-level overview. Feel free to post some questions if you have them or comments in the chat, and I'll hand it back to Anne Charlotte. Thanks so much.
And Kiana, if you could put our slides up, please. Great, sorry. Thank you, Jeremy, for this quick reminder / comparison between infills and Griffin development, as well as an introduction to the financial and climate implications of some Canadian municipal developments. Always good to see. So now we'll just dive into a case study. So following their introduction, detail Edmonton's approach to transforming the urban shape of the city by shifting the urban growth pattern and catalyzing redevelopment, including a snapshot on their brownfield redevelopment grants. So next slide, please. And I will start with by introducing Howaida Hassan, who is a General Supervisor of Urban Growth with the City of Edmonton. She leads a multidisciplinary team providing expertise in city growth to support evidence-based decision-making for planning and managing the cost of growth. And prior to this role, Howaida was a General Supervisor of the City Plan, which combines Edmonton's Municipal Development Plan and Transportation Master Plan, including strategic direction in environmental planning, social planning, and economic development. Howaida is interested in the cross-section of city building, climate, urban mobility, and equity, and how it shapes our cities. After following Howaida, we will have Liam McLennan, who is a principal planner with the Economic Investment Services branch of the City of Edmonton. And Liam currently manages the city's Brownfield Redevelopment Grant Program, or BRGP. Prior to this role, Liam was a principal planner working in industrial development, focusing on land use planning, development regulations, and sustainable infrastructure solutions. Liam is interested in applying land value capture tools to help achieve the city's growth and sustainability goals. We'll pass it over to Howaida.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. I think there's the slide. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. And Liam and I are coming to you from Treaty 6 Territory, City of Edmonton, so wanted to acknowledge that as well. So yeah, I'll start off by talking about the city plan. It's Edmonton's long-term strategic plan. It articulates the choices Edmonton needs to make to become a healthy, urban, climate resilient city that welcomes the next 1 million people. So it combines, as Charlotte said, our municipal development plan, transportation master plan, and it sets the planning direction not only for land use and transportation, but for our social, environmental, economic development goals as well. So it's really our top planning policy document in the municipality, and it guides our decision making and will be driving our budget decisions as well in the upcoming budget cycle, which I'll speak about briefly as well. And it was through the development of the plan that we seized the opportunity to really empirically understand the impacts of integrated land use, transportation planning, and to embed our climate mitigation into this statutory document. Next slide. So through a number of technical studies we conducted to develop the city plan, we identified a number of benefits similar to what Jeremy kind of went through with some of the other municipalities. So a lot of benefits that come from growing more efficiently and differently. So Edmonton is more of a suburban kind of development pattern. And we found that by virtue of a more compact development and increasing emphasis on infill, that the city plan concept was able to avoid the need to expand the city's footprint by additional 5,000 hectares. So just for reference, that's about half the size, just less than the size of a Manhattan. So that's very important in terms of carbon sequestration and not removing lands, agricultural lands, and retaining those lands. We also saw a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions due to better integration of that land use and transportation, but then layering on additional suite of progressive energy transition actions could result in about a 95% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions over business as usual, pardon me, growth pattern. More than 50% of future housing starts could be accommodated via redevelopment citywide. And finally, that fiscal performance piece is really important as well. So we found that the city was able to improve capital cost savings of about 10%, or $3 billion could be saved over the life of the plan. I'll note that that also translates into about an 8% reduction in taxes borne by residents. And a lot of that cost savings is largely due to that reduced need for new roads and the operations and maintenance that come with it. It's almost entirely driven by arterial roads and fewer interchanges being needed. So essentially what we learned is that we try to plan differently, that there are a number of important co-benefits that emerge for city residents. Next slide. So I'll discuss now the growth management framework, which is key to the city plan implementation and really important for achieving the city's city plan's goals. So ultimately, it's about allocating investment across the city to enable that desired shift in that growth pattern that we want to see. So this requires integration of location and financing of our municipal infrastructure. So it's achieved through capital investment, policies, and incentives. And essentially, the implementation of the growth management framework creates those conditions for success to improve the city's fiscal sustainability, achieve our climate goals, and our 15-minute communities goal. Our focus is that this 1.25 million horizon. So the city plan is actually kind of phases and stages that growth in population horizons, 250,000 population horizons, to get to the 2 million ultimate population. And so our focus on the 1.25 million horizon is about the next 10 to 12 years. And we're currently developing a program of components that will be implemented and then can then be adapted for those future horizons. Next slide. So I'll talk a bit about the 4 areas of focus for the growth management framework. Our first area of focus is about targeted infrastructure investment. So the city plan directs us to strategically expand infrastructure capacity to enable that future redevelopment to happen and intensity to be aligned with the priority growth areas, which I'll discuss shortly. But this kind of goes to the point that Jeremy was speaking about infill being expensive. And I think to some extent that may be true, but it depends on how you strategically place that investment. There may be ways to save, and I'll speak a little bit about that. So in this focus area, we need to think about 2 realms of infrastructure. There's city-owned and there's utility-owned. Here in the city of Edmonton, our sanitary, storm, and water infrastructure is owned by EPCOR, owned and maintained. And there are varying levels to which the city can influence these types of infrastructure because of the ownership structure, and so that it will also require different approaches. So with respect to the city-owned infrastructure, we're looking to advance a capital profile for council's consideration. We're in a budget year this year for 23 to 26. And in that, we're looking to have city-owned infrastructure be analyzed and be upgraded for some of those gaps in the redeveloping area, particularly those areas that we see seeing the highest amount of growth. And we'd like to leverage the right infrastructure renewal projects, say in transportation, open space, and facilities, and our neighborhood renewal program to augment the existing growth funding in those priority areas. So with respect to that underground infrastructure and those are the purview of, like I say, the Edmonton's utility provider, EPCOR, and we're working really closely with EPCOR to explore some specific impactful initiatives that we think could make a difference in overcoming some of those infrastructure barriers that infill sometimes experiences. So we have an existing infill fire protection cost share program. So what we have found is with infill, there's often the water infrastructure, particularly for fire flow, is a barrier and can be quite costly, whether it requires water mains or fire hydrants to be installed. So there's a cost share program in place to help with that. We're conducting analysis in particular nodes and corridors to identify preemptive or strategic water upgrades to open up those areas for development. And then we're also working with EPCOR to explore sanitary storage funding mechanisms to mitigate the need to upgrade the sanitary system, but rather slow the flow of stormwater into the combined sanitary and sewer system, which we have here at the city of Edmonton and the older areas. Next slide. So in the previous slide, I talked about priority growth areas in the redeveloping area of the city. And so this map shows the City of Edmonton's priority growth area locations to that 1.25 million horizon that I spoke of. And essentially priority growth areas are those are a set of 19 nodes and corridors that are expected to see the highest dwelling unit growth to that 1.25 million horizon in the city plan over the next 10 to 12 years. Priority nodes and corridors would be considered first and recommended by the growth management program for investment before other locations in the redeveloping area. And this is really about those trade-offs. So we know we can't, there's limited funding, we know we can't invest everywhere all at once. But so the city plan has helped us to focus in on what are those priority areas that we need to focus on. We're also thinking about developing a redevelopment market index. And so that tool will just give us additional intelligence about where redevelopment is most likely to happen. And so giving us a better ability to target almost surgically that investment a little better to align with private investment. So ultimately, it's really important that capital investments here are made in the right locations at the right time and relative to market demand and industry interest. Next slide. A second area of focus for us is prioritizing our capital investments in Edmonton's upcoming capital budget. So this involved developing some criteria that were embedded right into the city's priority-based budgeting process. So this is really where we're operationalizing the city plan geography and concept to achieve our goals. So it's really putting our money where our mouth is in terms of our strategic plan. So the scoring values public realm improvements, active transportation, recreational opportunities, open space, and other community infrastructure, and considers existing and anticipated demand in those areas. Next slide. Next, we're in the process of developing something called a substantial completion standard. And so this is a policy that was embedded in the city plan that essentially said we wouldn't open up our future growth areas until we had a better understanding of how well developed or how, that we had invested sufficiently in our developing area so that we don't take on additional new commitments when existing commitments haven't been fulfilled as far as complete communities. So that substantial completion supports that medium-term opportunity to address the many planned infrastructure commitments that we already have in the developing area of the city before we enable that new set of commitments to be planned and made. So we understand the lead time required to plan the future growth area, and that developing that can be an issue for industry, and so they require that. And so there is a bit of a balance there that we have to apply. And so finally, incentives are a tool that the city's been using quite effectively for some time. And I'll pass it shortly to Liam here to speak to the incentive that we've had in place for quite some time successfully here in Edmonton to support infill. But specifically, what we're looking at here is incentives that would enable growth management through things like tax deferral incentives, per door medium density, capital incentives, and also looking at infrastructure related incentives for electricity pole and anchor relocates, which we've heard are a bit of a barrier as well to redevelopment. And so with that, I'll pass it on to Liam to speak about the Brownfield Redevelopment Grant Program.
Thank you, Wada. Yes, I'll speak to a program we've had for close to 10 years, just to give you an idea of how the city is trying to achieve these goals. So the Brownfield program predates the city plan by quite a bit, but just due to the nature of the program itself, it does kind of help accomplish a lot of the goals set out by a city plan. And I think in the future, we're looking to refresh it to make that connection more explicit. So I'm sure you guys know what a brownfield is or have an idea of it. Essentially, it's just a property where previous use has contaminated a site, and that contamination represents a barrier to redevelopment. For the purposes of this program, a brownfield is a site that is underutilized and where past activities have may cause environmental, soil, and or groundwater contamination, and the site does kind of has promise for redevelopment. So quickly, historically, the city led a task force in 2010 to understand the problem of contaminated gas stations, which were becoming out of use and not being difficult to redevelop. So we passed a policy in 2013 and created this program the same year. Next slide. So the program basically gives money for property owners of contaminated sites to test, remediate, and redevelop their former fueling sites. So as of now, to qualify for the program, it has to be a former refueling site as opposed to any kind of contamination. For us, it doesn't necessarily have to be a commercial, like a former gas station. It can also be a site that just had above or below ground gasoline or diesel tanks that led to some contamination. We have 4 kinds of grant types. Phase 1 and 2 are testing. Phase 1 is more of a desktop study looking at historical records, that kind of thing. Phase 2 is more intense, where it actually requires consultants to go on the site and see what's actually there. We have a phase 4 grant, which is sustainable in situ remediation, where people typically inject a biological agent, which reduces the contamination over time. This allows the property, if there is an ongoing business on site, to stay active during that remediation period. And then I guess kind of the cornerstone of our program is a phase 3, which is both remediation and redevelopment. So this phase obligates the owner to not only remediate their site, but also redevelop it. And they will not receive compensation for the remediation until the development. We have received proof of occupancy permit. Next slide. So yeah, so since 2013, we have offered 9 phase 3 grants. These grants are funded with the tax uplift of the development. So it's kind of similar to like how a TIF would work. So we get a snapshot of the property, what its value was pre-development and then post-development. And then the developers are paid on that differential until the cost of remediation has been matched. Over those years, we've added additional $2 million in property tax revenue beyond what the base case would have been if it was not redeveloped. Canadian research on brownfields is quite limited, but what research there has been has demonstrated that for every dollar publicly invested in brownfield redevelopment, the municipality can expect to see $3.5 to $3.8 in output. Next slide. So these are sort of the estimated economic impacts of our program. So we've seen, to this point, the city has invested $7.3 million in dollars. We've seen economic activity that's resulted from these redevelopment of $62 million. There's been a long-term income of $3 million in jobs that have been created, and $15 million in increase in provincial and federal income taxes. Next slide. So these are 4 of some of the more maybe noteworthy projects that have received phase 3 funding. On the top left is Raymond Block. If anyone's familiar with Edmonton, this is along White Ave, which is one of our sort of premier, I guess, commercial streets. It's quite historic, a lot of buildings from the turn of the century, a lot of bars, restaurants located there. This is a former Petrocan station, which sat vacant at a very kind of crucial intersection of the street for close to a decade. So we were able to help them fund, and now they've done a mixed use residential development. On the top right is the Fox Towers, which is downtown, which is an area that was former, kind of our former warehousing district. And so this area has been really redeveloped a lot of late, which a lot of residential units, commercial, that kind of stuff. Again, this site was contaminated, so we were able to help fund them. I think this was predates my time, but this is the first one where we experimented with phase 3 grants, which operated based on future tax uplift. On the bottom left is South Park, which is a similar story to Raymond Block, it was a former pretty iconic car dealership on White Ave, which moved. And again, it's a site that's prime for redevelopment in a place where you did not want to see, a whole block essentially vacant for a decade. And then bottom right is North District, which is just like a commercial kind of revitalized strip mall in the north of the city. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we are in the process of refreshing the program, and we want to tie it closer to said city plan. I think we're looking at eliminating the phase 4 grants, adding former dry cleaning sites as eligible criteria. There are a lot of former dry cleaning sites in the city, and they're typically located in pretty important, like commercial and residential corridors. So they're prime for redevelopment. And then we'd like to add selection criteria based on location as the nodes and corridors, which Hueda talked about. Looking at the value and size of development and encouraging things like mixed uses. Next slide. Again, here's just, I guess, more emphasis on the nodes and corridors, which Hueda had talked about. So nodes, as you can imagine, are just nodes of activities, higher densities, mixed uses, and corridors are sort of streets and avenues that connect them, and they're also see a higher level of development activity. Next slide. Yeah, and then so the city plan is sort of the pillars of the city plan. Hueda doesn't mind me saying, defining it as such, are the big city moves, which are greener as we grow, a rebuildable city, a community of communities, inclusive and compassionate, and catalyze and converge. So despite the fact that the Brownfield program predates city plan, it actually outcomes fit quite neatly with these big city moves. For example, the Brownfield program has an incentive for the phase 3 grants, where if the developer builds to a LEED Gold standard, they will receive 100% of their remediation costs, as opposed to 50% if they build to a standard level. For rebuildable city, we are helping redevelop really problematic sites in areas we'd like to see redevelopment, as opposed to development in the brownfield. Communities, we've helped mixed use developments, encouraging commercial residential opportunities in existing communities. We've also, one of our first projects was affordable housing. So there's no affordable housing component to the program in terms of requirements, but it has been leveraged to provide affordable housing development in the city. And finally, it allows for redevelopment to be more financially listed in the city. I think a problem for context, and I think it's a difficulty with when you're trying to do growth management, is our city is surrounded by a satellite of smaller cities, which are typically cheaper to develop and have lower development standards. So there's always sort of an argument for the city when we're trying to do more forward-thinking policies, maybe demanding more from developers, that they'll just leave and develop in the outerlying communities. So I think that's where there is a solid role for more incentive-based programs to ensure that we see development in the city where we want, as opposed to it kind of leapfrogging us and going to surrounding municipalities. And that is it for me. Thank you for your time, and happy to answer questions along with Hueda and Jeremy.
Thank you, Jeremy, Liam, and Hueda. So we do have some questions, and I'll just jump right in with them. I saw Jeremy kindly and fiercely was typing very fast to answer some of them. I just wanted to come back actually on the one about a complete community. What does it look like? Especially Hueda, you mentioned also a 15-minute neighborhood. So if you could detail a bit more. I know Jeremy started to give an answer, but also providing more details, and also what are the implications of those 50-minute city goals in your different areas of focus, Hueda?
Yeah, for sure. So complete communities, I'll just start with that one first. So the city plan does talk about some of the types of amenities and services that contribute to complete communities. I would say it's still a bit of a work in progress to land on an actual definition of what a complete community is. But part of what we're doing through the substantial completion standard work for the developing area is trying to land on at least what are those important infrastructure pieces that the city should have in place, and how much residential development should be in place for us to start saying that those are complete communities and we can open up other areas. So some of the things we're considering is open space, commercial, amenity availability, transit services, and then just having some of the other harder infrastructure in place, like any of the retention, pond type of infrastructure and so on. So those are some of the things we're considering, as well as things like that are outside of municipal control, like school sites. In addition, we would look at other facilities, maybe like libraries, fire halls, those types of things. So that's what we're thinking about from a complete community perspective. And I think that dovetails well with what a 15-minute community is, and the city plan talks about that as basically being able to do what you would, your daily needs, complete your daily needs within 15 minutes of your home by non-auto modes, right? So walking, biking, taking transit. And that, I have to be honest, has been very resonating with our counselors, with the general public. I often hear counselors talking about wanting to achieve that 15-minute community. When will my community be a 15-minute community? So there is high interest around that concept, so, which is great. Like, I think just it resonates with people. It came through in our engagement on city plan, how important it was for people to have that availability of service near them. So yeah, like, I think that's how we're kind of looking at it from the city's perspective.
Thanks. And yeah, Jeremy, I don't know if you want to add more than what you answered previously.
No, I think that's good. I think that's a good summary. Sounds
good. I saw also you nicely replied to Susan and sorry, I think it was, I lost it, Ed, but there was some questions regarding rural communities. So on the future for infills, because you mentioned, Jeremy, you did say, you know, comparison between infill versus greenfields. And although there was Susan asking what, if you would have any insights or feedback on rural communities and their challenges when looking at, you know, the land use planning. And I will also open the floor to you, Huwaida and Liam. Liam, you mentioned around Edmonton, you have some smaller communities. So how did you notice same challenges? What was your approach to them? I'll start with you, Jeremy.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I have much to add beyond what I typed, but definitely rural development is an increasingly interesting topic. I think especially in the past 3 years, where we've seen a lot of, at least in Canada, a lot of migration from certain urban centers to rural areas. And it remains to be seen if that will endure or not. So I think the studies and the projections are still that urbanization is going to occur. But I think with the increased use of telepresence and remote working, it's maybe possible that we'll see a lot more rural dwellers. I think the real challenge in rural communities is adding population and having to provide services to them in kind of far-flung places. So like I'm thinking about emergency services and snow removal services, infrastructure upkeep. A lot of it really relies on residents contacting the municipality, as opposed to in urban centers where a lot of it is the municipality is able to monitor these things. So it's a very responsive sort of setup rather than proactive setup, which can cause these pressures when lots of things are kind of happening at the same time and you're very limited staff in rural municipalities or counties or regional districts. So I think there is still opportunity to capitalize on the infrastructure that already exists there, to develop close to that infrastructure or within that infrastructure, so that your costs are mitigated, your capital costs, and that you can cover the maintenance, the operation and maintenance costs through the tax base that you create with those new developments. But I think there's probably no one arrangement, like one development type or answer for rural municipalities and communities across Canada. I think it's going to be highly context dependent.
Thanks for this insight. I don't know if you want to talk about a bit of your experience, Huwaida and Liam. Otherwise, happy to jump in.
Just briefly, so Edmonton is situated I mean, it is pretty much the urban service center for, you know, situated in a region of about 1.4 million people, or about 1 million. And so, like, I think the city has recognized that it offers that, those amenities, those services that the regional residents are looking for. And so there's been conversations with the regional communities to speak about, like, sharing costs of infrastructure and other things like that. You know, those conversations have happened. And I think it does speak to, like, what Jeremy was saying about it is difficult with smaller populations to provide the kind of breadth of service that you would find in an urban center. When we did our city plan modeling work and analysis, we did take a regional approach, at least to the transportation related pieces. And so we did consider what growth looks like, what travel looks like, in consideration of that growth happening also in the region. So we, you know, as much as the city plan is focused just on the city of Edmonton, the analysis did consider what kind of demand we might see from neighboring areas as well.
That's good to hear. Thanks for this information. Time is flying. I will ask one more question, and unfortunately we'll have to stop. I think this one is for Liam, specifically regarding your brownfield grant program. David is asking why are dry cleaning sites being added? And you are muted, Liam.
Well, we're looking at adding them because they do represent a source of contamination. And just observationally, you can see that they're in areas we'd like to see redeveloped. We don't want to see them remain vacant. And for us, because I think when it was created, there was a rationale for limiting the eligible sites to just gas stations. We didn't have unlimited dollars, but I think if we're looking to tie it closer to the city plan, that is by definition going to exclude parts of the city, or at least make it difficult for them to receive the grant. So in recognition of that, we should open it up to ensure that there are sites, more eligible sites, so we can see this program fund more redevelopment. That's just the kind of high level rationale for adding more.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm sure David appreciated the answer. You know what? I'll give one more minute. Jeremy, if you want to tackle, or I think you're typing. Okay, so I'll let you type. Please continue. So hopefully Justin can have an answer. And we'll have to, sorry, Odessa, I just saw your question, but we'll have to wrap it up. So Kiana, if you could go to the next slide, please. Feel free, maybe Hoida and Liam, to have a look at Odessa question, or otherwise I'm sure you can be in touch after this webinar. But we have to say goodbye for now. So some quick next step is on August 25th, we have our next installment of the GMF webinar series, where you will learn what circular economy is and why it is important for your municipalities. So feel free to join us on August 25th. I believe Kiana will share the link in the chat so have a look at it. And if you want to dive deeper into the topic of intensification, the Green Municipal Fund also recently published a case study on Regina, a city who took steps to revitalize and grow their city core while identifying the barriers to intensification. So we will also share the link in the chat. And also good news, if you haven't heard yet, GMF Sustainable Communities Conference is coming back in February 2023 for its first hybrid edition. So please save the date and have a look at the conference page as more information will gradually be published on it. And again, the link is in the chat. And with that, we have a quick question for you, just to let us know how the webinar how did the webinar go, if you found that it met the objectives. And I would like to thank our panelists of today. So thank you, Jeremy, Liam, and Hoida, for your insights, presentation of Edmonton's framework and also taking the time to answer the different questions of our participants. And it's 2 o'clock. We will unfortunately have to say goodbye already. So thank you again to our panelists, and we will see you on August 25th for the most of you, I hope. Thank you.